The police station was quiet, the kind of quiet that made the ticking of the clock on the wall sound louder than it should. The officers were going about their usual routines, filling out reports, sipping coffee, and chatting about the day's events. That's when the door creaked open. A young girl, no older than 16, stepped inside. Her clothes were disheveled, her hair a tangled mess, and her face streaked with tears. She looked around the room with wide, terrified eyes, clutching a small, worn-out backpack to her chest. The moment she saw the officers, she broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a kind face, immediately stood up and approached her. Hey, it's okay. You're safe here. What's wrong? He asked gently, guiding her to a chair. The girl struggled to speak, her voice trembling. I don't know where else to go. I saw something terrible. It's going to happen, and no one believes me. The officer exchanged a glance with his colleague. What did you see? He asked, trying to keep his tone calm. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she wiped her tears. I saw the end of the world. Not in a dream, it was real. I was there. I saw it all, the fires, the screams, the destruction. And it's coming, in 7 days. The room fell silent. The officer stared at her, unsure how to respond. The girl's words were chilling, but her desperation was undeniable. Okay, the officer said slowly, trying to make sense of her story. Can you tell us more? How do you know this? She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if she was afraid someone might overhear. I can't explain it all right now. But you have to believe me. If we don't do something, everyone will die. Everyone. The other officers exchanged skeptical looks. It sounded like the ramblings of a scared teenager, but there was something about her, something in her eyes, that made them pause. Before anyone could say anything more, the girl leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. I know you don't believe me. I wouldn't believe me either. But I can prove it. Tomorrow, at exactly 3:17 p.m., there will be a power outage in the city. It will last for exactly 12 minutes. You'll see. The officers were stunned. How could she possibly know something like that? Was it a lucky guess, or was there more to her story? The kind officer nodded slowly. All right. We'll keep an eye out. But for now, let's get you some help, okay? You look like you've been through a lot. As they led her to a quieter room, the girl turned back, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. You'll see, she repeated. And when you do, you'll have to trust me. Because if you don't, there won't be a world left to save. The officers didn't know what to make of her words, but one thing was certain, this was no ordinary case. Something strange was happening, and they were about to find out just how strange it could get. The next day, the police station buzzed with an unusual tension. The officers couldn't shake the memory of the girl's haunting words. Was she delusional? Or was there a sliver of truth to her claims? The kind officer who had spoken to her the previous night, let's call him Officer Harris, couldn't stop thinking about her. There was something about her desperation that felt real, too real to ignore. At 3 p.m., Officer Harris glanced at the clock. 17 minutes. That's all they had to wait. He found himself pacing the station, his eyes darting to the lights above. The other officers noticed his unease, but said nothing. They were all secretly curious, though none would admit it. 3:15 p.m. 2 minutes to go. The station was unusually quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. Then, at exactly 3:17 p.m., the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then, darkness. The hum of the computers died, and the station was plunged into silence. What the? Someone muttered, their voice cutting through the stillness. Officer Harris felt his heart race. He pulled out his phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the room. Around him, the other officers did the same, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. 12 minutes later, just as the girl had predicted, the power came back on. The station buzzed back to life, but the atmosphere had changed. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. That was weird, one officer said, breaking the silence. Weird doesn't even begin to cover it, another replied. Officer Harris didn't say a word. He grabbed his coat and headed straight for the room where the girl was being kept. She was sitting on a small cot, her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red from crying but filled with a quiet determination. "You were right," he said, his voice low. "The power went out, just like you said it would." She nodded slowly, as if she had expected this. "I told you. I'm not lying." Officer Harris sat down across from her, leaning forward. "Okay. I believe you. But you need to tell me everything. Who are you? How do you know these things?" The girl hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her shirt. "It's complicated. I'm not from here. Not from this time. Or maybe not even this world. I don't know how to explain it without sounding crazy." "Try me," Officer Harris said gently. She took a deep breath. "In my world, scientists discovered a way to manipulate time. They called it the temporal shift. It was supposed to be a way to fix mistakes, to prevent disasters. But something went wrong. The experiment, it created a rift. And now, that rift is spreading. If it's not stopped, it will destroy everything, your world, my world, everything." Officer Harris stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. It sounded like something out of a science fiction movie, but the power outage, that had been real. Too real. "All right," he said slowly. "Let's say I believe you. What do we do? How do we stop it?" Before she could answer, the door to the room burst open. Another officer rushed in, his face pale. "Harris, you need to see this." Officer Harris stood up, glancing back at the girl. "Stay here. I'll be back." He followed his colleague to the main room, where a crowd had gathered around a computer screen. On it was a live news feed. A reporter stood in front of a massive crater in the middle of a city street, her voice shaking as she spoke. Authorities are baffled by this sudden phenomenon. Witnesses claim the ground simply opened up, swallowing several cars and pedestrians. Rescue efforts are underway, but the cause remains unknown. The room fell silent. Officer Harris felt a chill run down his spine. He turned to his colleague. "When did this happen?" "About 10 minutes ago," the officer replied. "Right after the power came back on." Officer Harris's mind raced. This couldn't be a coincidence. He turned and hurried back to the girl's room, his heart pounding. When he opened the door, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. "It's starting, isn't it?" she whispered. He nodded. "Tell me what we need to do." The man in the black suit stepped into the station, his presence commanding immediate attention. His sharp eyes scanned the room, landing on Officer Harris. Without a word, he pulled out a badge and held it up. "Agent Collins," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm with the Department of Temporal Affairs. I'm here to take the girl into custody." Officer Harris frowned, glancing at the badge. It looked official, but he'd never heard of any Department of Temporal Affairs. Something about this man didn't sit right with him. "Temporal Affairs?" Harris repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What's that?" Agent Collins didn't blink. "Classified. But I assure you, this matter is far above your pay grade. The girl is part of a highly sensitive operation, and I need to take her with me immediately." Harris crossed his arms, his protective instincts kicking in. "She's just a kid. And she's scared. If she's involved in something, she needs help, not to be whisked away by some secret agency." Agent Collins's expression hardened. "Officer, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. This isn't up for debate. Hand her over, or there will be consequences." The tension in the room was palpable. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do. Harris, however, wasn't ready to back down. "Look," he said, keeping his voice steady, "if you want to take her, you're going to have to explain what's going on. She's not going anywhere until I know she's safe." Agent Collins sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Very well. But what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room. Understood?" Harris nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed a word this man was about to say. "The girl is part of an experiment," Collins began. "A project designed to explore the possibilities of time manipulation. Something went wrong, and now she's a liability. My job is to contain this situation before it spirals out of control." Harris's mind raced. The girl had mentioned something about time manipulation, but this man's cold, clinical tone made it sound even more sinister. "Contain the situation?" Harris repeated. "What does that mean, exactly?" Collins hesitated for a moment, then said, "It means I need to take her to a secure facility where she can't cause any more damage. The things she knows, the things she's seen, they're dangerous. Not just to her, but to everyone." Harris glanced back at the girl's room, his gut telling him something was off. "And what happens to her after you take her? What kind of secure facility are we talking about?" Collins's expression didn't change. "That's classified. But I can assure you, she'll be well taken care of." Harris didn't like the sound of that. He'd seen enough movies to know that well taken care of often meant something very different in the world of secret agencies. "I'm sorry," Harris said firmly, "but until I see some proper documentation and a court order, she's not going anywhere." Collins's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Harris thought the man might try to force his way through. But then, to his surprise, Collins simply nodded. "Fine," he said. "I'll be back with the necessary paperwork. But let me make one thing clear, officer. This isn't over. The girl is a danger to herself and others. If you don't cooperate, you'll be putting everyone at risk." With that, Collins turned and walked out of the station, leaving Harris and the other officers in stunned silence. Harris wasted no time. He hurried back to the girl's room, his mind racing. When he opened the door, she looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Someone who says he's here to help you," Harris replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "But I'm not letting him take you anywhere until I know what's really going on." The girl shook her head frantically. "You can't trust him. He's not who he says he is. If he takes me, I'll never see the light of day again." Harris sat down across from her, his expression serious. "Then you need to tell me everything. Who are you? Where are you from? And why is this man after you?" The girl took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she clutched her backpack. "I told you before. I'm not from here. Not from this world. In my universe, scientists discovered how to travel between dimensions. But something went wrong. The experiment created a rift, and now that rift is spreading. If it's not stopped, it will destroy everything, your world, my world, everything." Harris listened intently, his mind struggling to keep up. "And this man? Agent Collins, what does he want?" "He works for the people who started the experiment," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They don't want anyone to know the truth. They'll do whatever it takes to keep it hidden." Harris felt a chill run down his spine. If what she was saying was true, then this was bigger than anything he'd ever dealt with. "All right," he said finally. "If we're going to stop this, we need to act fast. But we can't do it alone. We need proof." The girl nodded, reaching into her backpack. She pulled out a small, strange-looking device, a sleek, metallic object with glowing blue lights. "This is a temporal stabilizer," she said. "It's the only thing that can close the rift. But we need to get to the source. And we need to do it before Collins comes back." Harris stared at the device, his mind racing. This was insane. But the power outage, the crater in the city, it all added up. Okay, he said, standing up. Let's go. Officer Harris and the girl moved quickly, slipping out of the police station through a back entrance. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an uneasy stillness. The girl clutched the temporal stabilizer tightly, her eyes darting around as if expecting danger at every turn. Where are we going? Harris asked, keeping his voice low. Somewhere safe, the girl replied. But we need to hurry. Collins won't wait long before he comes back. Harris nodded, though his mind was still reeling. Everything about this situation felt surreal, but he couldn't ignore the evidence, the power outage, the crater, the girl's predictions. Something was happening, something far beyond his understanding. They turned down a narrow alley, the girl leading the way with surprising confidence. Finally, she stopped in front of an old, abandoned building. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. In here, she said, pushing the door open. Harris followed her inside, the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under their weight. The girl moved to the center of the room, where a strange, circular pattern was etched into the floor. What is this place? Harris asked, looking around. A safe house, the girl replied. At least, it was in my world. We used it to hide from the people who wanted to stop us. She knelt down and placed the temporal stabilizer in the center of the circle. The device hummed softly, the blue lights glowing brighter. This stabilizer can open a portal to my world, she explained. But it's dangerous. If we're not careful, it could make things worse. Harris frowned. Worse how? The rift between our worlds is unstable, she said. If we're not precise, it could tear open completely, destroying both universes. Harris felt a knot form in his stomach. And you're sure this is the only way? The girl nodded. We need to see the source of the rift. Only then can we figure out how to stop it. Before Harris could respond, the stabilizer began to emit a low, pulsating sound. The air around them seemed to shimmer, and a faint, glowing light appeared in the center of the circle. It's working, the girl said, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and fear. Harris watched in awe as the light grew brighter, forming a swirling vortex. The room around them seemed to warp and bend, as if reality itself was being pulled into the portal. Are you sure this is safe? Harris asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the stabilizer. No, the girl admitted. But we don't have a choice. She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm. Stay close to me. And whatever you do, don't let go. Harris nodded, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath and stepped into the light. The sensation was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. It felt as though his body was being pulled apart and put back together at the same time. Colors and shapes swirled around him, and for a moment, he couldn't tell which way was up. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. Harris stumbled forward, his legs shaky. He looked around, his eyes widening in shock. They were standing in the middle of a city, but it was unlike any city Harris had ever seen. The buildings were twisted and crumbling, their surfaces covered in strange, glowing cracks. The sky was a deep, unnatural red, and the air was thick with ash. What is this place? Harris asked, his voice trembling. This is my world, the girl said quietly. Or what's left of it. Harris turned to her, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This is what's going to happen to our world. The girl nodded, her eyes filled with sadness. If we don't stop the rift, yes. This is what's coming. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. He looked around, taking in the devastation. The streets were empty, the silence broken only by the distant sound of crumbling buildings. How did this happen? He asked. The experiment, the girl replied. They thought they could control it. They thought they could use it to fix their mistakes. But they were wrong. The rift grew too powerful, and when it collapsed, it took everything with it. Harris shook his head, his mind racing. And you think we can stop it from happening to our world? We have to try, the girl said firmly. But the twisted figures closed in, their glowing eyes piercing through the ash-filled air. Officer Harris and the girl moved as quickly as they could, darting through the ruins of the city. The girl clutched the temporal stabilizer tightly, her eyes scanning their surroundings for a safe path. This way, she shouted, pulling Harris down a narrow alley. The alley was dark and cluttered with debris, but it offered some cover from the pursuing figures. Harris glanced over his shoulder, his heart racing as he saw the creatures gaining ground. We can't outrun them forever, he said, his voice strained. We don't have to, the girl replied. The source of the rift is just ahead. If we can reach it, we might be able to stabilize it before it's too late. Harris nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. All he knew was that they had to keep moving. They burst out of the alley into a large, open square. In the center of the square was a massive, swirling vortex of light and energy. It pulsed and crackled, sending shockwaves through the air. The ground around it was cracked and crumbling, as if the very earth was being torn apart. That's it, the girl said, her voice filled with awe and fear. The source of the rift. Harris stared at the vortex, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. It was like nothing he had ever imagined, a tear in reality itself. What do we do now? He asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the vortex. The girl held up the temporal stabilizer. We use this to close the rift. But it's not going to be easy. The stabilizer needs to be calibrated perfectly, or it could make things worse. Harris frowned. Worse how? If we're not careful, the rift could collapse entirely, taking both of our worlds with it, she explained. Harris felt a chill run down his spine. Great. No pressure. Before they could move, a loud growl echoed through the square. Harris turned to see the twisted figures emerging from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on them. We're out of time, the girl said, her voice urgent. We need to do this now. Harris nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. I'll hold them off. You focus on the stabilizer. The girl hesitated, her eyes filled with worry. But. No arguments, Harris said firmly. Just do it. The girl nodded, her hands trembling as she began to adjust the stabilizer. Harris stepped in front of her, his weapon raised. The twisted figures charged, their movements erratic and unnatural. Harris fired, the sound of the shots echoing through the square. The figures staggered but didn't stop. They were relentless, their glowing eyes filled with a strange, otherworldly hunger. Hurry! Harris shouted, his voice strained as he fired again. The girl's hands moved quickly, her fingers dancing over the stabilizer's controls. The device hummed louder, the blue lights glowing brighter. Almost there, she muttered, her voice filled with concentration. Harris fired again, but the figures were getting closer. One of them lunged at him, its jagged claws slashing through the air. Harris dodged, but the creature's claws grazed his arm, leaving a deep gash. He cried out in pain, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Harris, the girl shouted, her voice filled with panic. Just keep going, he yelled, firing again. The girl took a deep breath, her hand steadying as she made the final adjustments. The stabilizer's hum grew louder, the blue lights flashing rapidly. It's ready, she shouted. Harris turned to her, his heart pounding. Do it. The girl pressed a button on the stabilizer, and a beam of light shot out, connecting with the vortex. The vortex pulsed and shuddered, the energy swirling faster and faster. The twisted figures let out a deafening roar, their movements becoming more frantic. They lunged at Harris and the girl, their claws slashing through the air. Harris fired again, but it was no use. The creatures were too close. It's working, the girl shouted, her voice filled with hope. The rift is stabilizing. But before Harris could respond, one of the creatures lunged at him, its claws slashing through his chest. He cried out in pain, falling to the ground. Harris, the girl screamed, her voice filled with terror. Harris looked up at her, his vision blurring. Do it, close it. The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She pressed another button on the stabilizer, and the beam of light grew brighter. The vortex pulsed one last time, then collapsed in on itself, disappearing with a deafening roar. The twisted figures let out a final, agonized scream before disintegrating into ash. The square fell silent, the air thick with tension. The girl rushed to Harris's side, her hands trembling as she tried to stop the bleeding. "Hold on, Harris. Please, hold on." Harris looked up at her, his breathing shallow. "Did it work?" The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. "The rift is closed." "You did it." Harris managed a weak smile. "We did it." But before he could say anything more, his eyes closed, and his body went still. The girl knelt beside Harris, her hands pressing desperately against the wound on his chest. Blood seeped through her fingers, and her mind raced. She couldn't lose him, not after everything they'd been through. "Harris, stay with me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "You can't leave me now. Not like this." But Harris didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. The girl's heart sank as she realized how bad it was. She looked around, her eyes scanning the desolate square for anything that could help. The temporal stabilizer lay nearby, its lights flickering weakly. The girl's mind raced. The device was designed to manipulate time and space. Could it be used to save him? She didn't know, but she had to try. She grabbed the stabilizer, her hands shaking as she adjusted the settings. The device hummed faintly, but it was clear its power was nearly drained. Come on," she muttered, her voice filled with desperation. The stabilizer's lights flickered again, and a faint beam of light shot out, enveloping Harris's body. The girl held her breath, her eyes fixed on him. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the wound on Harris's chest began to close. His breathing steadied, and color returned to his face. The girl let out a sob of relief, her hands trembling as she watched him. "Harris? Can you hear me?" Harris's eyes fluttered open, and he groaned softly. What happened?" "You were hurt," the girl said, her voice choked with emotion. "But I think I fixed it. The stabilizer, it healed you." Harris sat up slowly, wincing as he touched his chest. The wound was gone, but the memory of the pain was still fresh. "You saved me," he said, his voice filled with awe. The girl shook her head. "You saved me first. And now we need to get out of here." Harris nodded, though he still felt weak. "The rift, is it really closed?" The girl glanced at the stabilizer, its lights now dim. "For now. But it's not over. The rift was just a symptom of a bigger problem. If we don't fix the source, it will open again. And next time, it might be worse." Harris frowned. "What do you mean?" "The experiment that caused all of this, it's still happening in your world," the girl explained. "If we don't stop it, the same thing will happen there." Harris's heart sank. "How do we stop it?" The girl hesitated, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "We need to destroy the machine that created the rift. But it's heavily guarded, and the people behind it, they'll do anything to protect it." Harris took a deep breath, his mind racing. "Then we don't have a choice. We have to go back." The girl nodded, though her expression was grim. "But the stabilizer, it's almost out of power. We'll only have one chance to open a portal back to your world. And once we're there, we'll have to move fast." Harris stood up, his legs still shaky. "Then let's do it. We can't waste any more time." The girl adjusted the stabilizer one last time, her hands steady, despite the fear in her eyes. The device hummed weakly, and a small portal began to form. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Once we step through, there's no turning back." Harris nodded, his jaw set. "Let's go." They stepped through the portal, the familiar sensation of being pulled apart and put back together washing over them. When they emerged, they were back in the abandoned building where they had started. The girl collapsed to her knees, the stabilizer slipping from her hands. Its lights flickered one last time before going dark. "It's done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The stabilizer, it's out of power." Harris knelt beside her, his expression serious. "Then we'll have to do this the old-fashioned way." "Where's the machine?" The girl took a deep breath, her eyes filled with determination. "It's in a secret facility outside the city. But we'll need help to get inside." Harris nodded, his mind racing. "I know someone who might be able to help." Officer Harris and the girl moved quickly through the city, staying in the shadows to avoid drawing attention. The stabilizer was useless now, its power completely drained. They were on their own, and time was running out. Harris led the way to a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of the city. He knocked on the door in a specific pattern, 3 quick knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The door opened a crack, and a man's face appeared. He was in his late 50s, with graying hair and a stern expression. When he saw Harris, his eyes widened in surprise. "Harris? What the hell are you doing here?" the man asked, his voice low. "I need your help, Captain," Harris said, his tone urgent. "It's a long story, but we don't have much time." The man, Captain Reynolds, hesitated for a moment, then opened the door wider. "Get inside. Both of you." Harris and the girl stepped inside, and Reynolds closed the door behind them. The house was modest but well kept, with a lived-in feel. "Who's this?" Reynolds asked, nodding toward the girl. "She's part of the story," Harris said. "But first, we need to know if you can help us get into the Blackwood facility." Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "Blackwood? That's a high-security government site. What the hell do you want there?" Harris took a deep breath. "There's something inside that could destroy the world. We need to stop it." Reynolds stared at him, his expression unreadable. "You're serious, aren't you?" "Dead serious," Harris replied. Reynolds sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right. I'll help you. But this is going to be dangerous. If we get caught, we're all dead." Harris nodded. "We don't have a choice." Reynolds turned to the girl. "And you? What's your role in all this?" The girl hesitated, then said, "I'm the only one who knows how to stop it. But I can't do it alone." Reynolds studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's get to work." Over the next few hours, Reynolds. When Harris opened his eyes, he was lying on the ground, his body aching and his ears ringing. The room was filled with smoke, and the machine was completely destroyed. The guards were gone, either dead or fled. But the girl. Harris's heart sank as he saw her lying a few feet away, her body still and lifeless. He crawled over to her, his hands trembling as he touched her face. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, no." But she didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful. Harris felt a wave of grief wash over him, but he knew he couldn't give up. Not yet. He stood up, his legs shaky, and looked around. The facility was in ruins, but he could hear sirens in the distance. They didn't have much time. Harris picked up the girl's body, his heart heavy with sorrow. He had to get her out of here. He couldn't leave her behind. As he made his way through the wreckage, he thought about everything they had been through. The girl had sacrificed herself to save him, to save their world. He couldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. When he finally reached the exit, he was met by Captain Reynolds, who looked battered but alive. "Harris!" Reynolds shouted, rushing over to him. "What happened? Is she?" Harris shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "She's gone. But she saved us. She saved everyone." Reynolds's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Harris's shoulder. "I'm sorry, son. But we need to get out of here. The authorities are on their way, and we can't be caught." Harris nodded, though his heart was heavy. He followed Reynolds to a waiting car, where they placed the girl's body in the back seat. As they drove away from the facility, Harris stared out the window, his mind racing. The girl had given everything to stop the rift, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to do. What now? Harris asked, his voice hollow. Reynolds glanced at him, his expression grim. Now, we make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. We expose the truth about what happened here. The people behind this, they need to be held accountable. Harris nodded, though he felt a deep sense of loss. The girl had been brave and selfless, and he would make sure the world knew her story. The days that followed were a blur for Officer Harris. The destruction of the Blackwood facility made headlines, but the true story remained hidden. The government quickly labeled it as a tragic accident, burying any mention of the machine or the rift. But Harris and Captain Reynolds weren't about to let the truth disappear. They worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and reaching out to trusted journalists. It wasn't easy, those behind the experiment had powerful allies, and every step forward felt like a battle. But Harris was determined. The girl's sacrifice had given him a purpose, and he wasn't going to let her down. One evening, Harris sat alone in his apartment, staring at a photograph he'd taken of the girl during their journey. She was smiling, her eyes filled with hope. It was a rare moment of peace amidst the chaos, and it reminded him of why he was fighting. There was a knock at the door. Harris opened it to find Reynolds standing there, holding a folder. "We've got it," Reynolds said, his voice filled with quiet triumph. "Enough evidence to expose everything. It's going public tomorrow." Harris felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the weight of everything they'd lost. "She would have been proud," he said softly. Reynolds nodded. "She was brave. Braver than most. We owe it to her to make sure the world knows what she did." The next day, the story broke. The headlines were explosive: "Government experiment nearly destroys world, heroic sacrifice saves humanity, the girl who stopped the rift." The public outcry was immediate, and the people behind the experiment were quickly brought to justice. Harris watched it all unfold from the sidelines, his heart heavy but hopeful. The girl's story had inspired millions, and her sacrifice had not been in vain. A few weeks later, Harris visited the girl's grave. It was a quiet, peaceful place, far from the chaos of the city. He knelt down, placing a single flower on the stone. "You did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saved us. And I'll never forget you." As he stood there, a gentle breeze swept through the trees, carrying with it a sense of peace. Harris felt a strange warmth, as if the girl was there with him, watching over him. He left the cemetery with a renewed sense of purpose. The world was still far from perfect, but it was worth fighting for. And he would honor the girl's memory by continuing to protect it. Lesson. The story ends with a powerful message about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The girl's selfless action saved countless lives, and her legacy serves as a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is hope. Her story inspires us to face our fears, fight for what we believe in, and never give up, no matter how impossible the odds may seem.